So in today's video, I want to cover the importance of tracking and measuring consistently and accurately metrics relative to training volume in consideration of your secondary exercises. This is often a topic that's both overlooked and undervalued, so much so that few trainees even go so far as to loosely track these numbers, and most individuals don't track anything at all. They completely ignore the secondary exercises. They just kind of wing this section of their training knowing they've got to do 4x10 of something that feels moderately challenging. Interestingly enough, it's often assumed that this accessory work is not as important in consideration of tracking with specificity as is the primary lifts. That being whatever your main compound movements are going to be, what variations you might be employing. But that's not the case. Ignoring the accurate tracking of your secondary exercises actually undermines your long-term measurability and management of those numbers. And curiously, it actually proves to be an incredible hindrance when you don't have this data over the long term. Consider that your accessory work, even though it's not the exciting big PR work that you might be doing under or over the bar on a regular basis relative to your deadlifts, your squats, and your presses and variations thereof, it is in fact the work necessary to build an adequate foundation that you're actually able to move these impressive loads and accomplish these incredible feats both in the short and long term. That's why a significant portion of your training time is spent on these accessory lifts, or at the very least it should be. And to ignore such a significant portion of the effort that you put into the weight room in consideration of that measurability and your diligent tracking is actually a gross misstep. A mistake made by many, but that really should not be made by any who seek to make long-term progress in the weight room. Although there are many reasons why accurately tracking and measuring all of this data is important, there's two that stand out as the most valuable to me, both from a coaching perspective as well as from a training perspective relative to my own workouts and progressions. But they're both relative to a very simple formula, a formula that I often reference, and you've likely heard it at some point yourself. And that is stress plus recovery equals adaptation. Obviously, in this formula, the desired outcome is the adaptation. And what's worth noting when it comes to tracking that training volume on your accessory lifts is how valuable it becomes relative to the application of stress and, of course, the management of your recovery. The first point that I would like to make is how it relates to your ability to reference past performances and save time in the gym. Or butchered that one. Let's try and spell properly today. That'd be great. So understand that when you have all of this data tracked, it becomes much easier to manage. And being able to reference your past performances in the gym in consideration of the training volume on your accessory lifts is valuable in and of itself for two reasons. The first one being you can look back to what accessory exercises and relative performances actually contributed to the most progress on the lifts that are meaningful to you. For example, Maybe you found that there were specific tricep exercises that whenever they were in your training in the 15 to 20 rep range, that you were able to break through plateaus on the bench press much easier. Or maybe you found that when you incorporated a hamstring variation in the 6 to 10 rep range heavy, and then followed it up with high rep work in the 20 to 30 rep range with a single joint movement, that you would hit much bigger PRs on conventional deadlifts. Being able to look back at this volume over time is what's going to allow you to determine what works for you and what doesn't work all that well, and maybe what doesn't seem to work at all, or doesn't seem to work at all at that current stage in your training. This is valuable information because it will allow you to structure your workout regimen much more efficiently and effectively as you move forward. Another point is being able to reference numbers on past accessory variations. This itself is an incredible time saver. Understand that two issues can come into play if you don't remember where you were with a specific exercise. The first being that any variation you might employ, whether it's a changing of a specialty bar on a secondary exercise, whether it's the use of a different attachment, or what may be in further variations that could be employed, the reality is that they're all a little bit different. And sometimes, even though they seem similar, your performance on them can be dramatic in consideration of the disparity between both variations. Kind of like a wide grip pull down versus a close grip pull down with your palms facing towards you. Typically, people are going to excel much more on the latter variation, and the gap in performance will be significant. That being said, assuming that you can do something because you kind of remembered what you used to do on a similar variation isn't optimal. Yeah, it might work here and there, but wouldn't you much rather know exactly where you left off in a specific rep range or in total load? This way, at least, as you jump back into an accessory variation that you might not have used in 6 to 8 months, you can manage it much more effectively. Maybe you'll start off 5% easier than where you left off originally, only to end 5 or 7% further ahead, knowing that you've made measurable progress in the right direction on that foundational work, which in and of itself is contributing to the building of muscle and the development of strength that's going to allow you to move that big weight on the barbell on your primary lifts. That being said, if you come into one of these exercise variations that you haven't done in quite a while, and you put too little weight on the bar, or on the cable machine, or grab a dumbbell set that's much too light for that variation, you tend to waste time. And it might seem tedious, it might seem trivial, like, oh, we'll just raise the weight. Sure. But then what if you raise it too heavy? Or what if you end up, there's so many factors at play, but if you knew exactly where you left off, you wouldn't waste that same amount of time. It seems silly, but for those of you who are diligent with your efforts and who are the most calculated when it comes to training, this is going to be very valuable to prioritize. Then, of course, building off of this reference point, the other important consideration when it comes to measuring this is the application of stress and how it relates to recovery, specifically relative to total training volume on any of these exercise variations. This has come to be a complete game changer for me, because this is actually information I now consider that I used to completely ignore. And it's allowed me to make continued progress. And it's rewarding both physically and mentally. Not only is it easier for me to continue to build muscular strength and size, because I'm valuing these numbers that previously meant very little to me, but also psychologically, because the reality is you're not always going to win on every lift, but you can always win on some of the exercises that you do in the gym. So it's not uncommon for me to be doing some deload style work on the barbell, and I'm hungry for a progression. That progression itself is incredibly intoxicating, very rewarding, as anyone who has been bitten by the iron bug can attest to. Instead of deviating from that deload, instead of falling victim to the frustration of maybe spending 3 or 4 weeks doing skill-based work where I'm not hitting any big PRs, I can at least feel satisfaction knowing that, hey, 2 of my accessory exercises have increased 1.63% in volume, or I've added another half pound to a barbell curl in the 20 rep range. That is progress. That is contributing to the building out of my suit of armor and the fortifying of the foundation with which I move those bigger weights upon. Now, when it comes to the stress and recovery, let's say as an example, you were doing 25-pound chest presses for 15 to 20 reps. And that would result in you doing somewhere between 1,125 pounds and 1,500 pounds of volume across all 3 working sets. And that's important to note because people just look at the fact that they did 25 pounds and now next week they feel confident, so they want to jump to 35 pounds. But that 35 pounds is a 10-pound jump. If you simply went to the 30s and worked in the 12 to 15 rep range, I believe you'd be doing somewhere between 1080 and 1350 in consideration of total work volume. Well, you'll notice there's a significant overlap of a couple of 100 pounds in these 2 loads and relative rep range. This is important to be aware of because when it comes to achieving a desirable adaptation, you must manage this stress and recovery, as I've mentioned in previous videos on the topic. People don't really consider the cumulative effect of stress, and they often overlook and undervalue recovery. Therefore, this gets completely ignored, even though it's incredibly impactful. Realize that the stress you apply has to be an increase. Sure, it must be progressive, but it has to be a manageable amount, so much so that you're actually able to recover from it. If you apply too great of a jump in stress, even though you may be able to physically complete the task, it doesn't mean that your body will be able to manage the recovery efficiently and effectively enough to drive a desirable adaptation in a short enough period of time with which you can actually get back to the application of stress again in a timely manner. If you were to jump to the 35-pound dumbbells and you were able to just squeeze out those repetitions, as you can see, not only would you have an increase in load, which would be contributing its own form of increased stress because you're lifting something heavier, and that in and of itself applies stress. But also the reality that if you manage to squeeze out those same repetitions, the jump in volume would now surpass what you were accomplishing over here. So you run the risk of not only increasing the volume dramatically, but also increasing the load dramatically. Now the chances of you not being able to recover from that application of stress are now greater. And that means you're less likely to experience the desired adaptations that you're looking for. Now, if you didn't rush it and you simply jumped to this 30-pound increase and you cleared the volume right here, you'd be well within your recovery capacity, setting yourself up to consequently move to the 35s and 40s in due time at a methodical pace with which those increases would be manageable. What's worth noting here is you probably caught on that the rep ranges are not the same because as the load has increased, the expectation itself has decreased to ensure that this performance here, this volume being considered on the accessory lifts, is actually manageable and allows for this to occur. Remember, this accessory work that you're doing is a significant portion of your training, and it's incredibly valuable considering it is, and I know I sound like a broken record, exactly what forms that fortification of the foundation with which you will build your big compound lifts upon. It's working against you to consider this to be fluff accessory work, to ignore it or to barely track it loosely. This accessory work should be managed as diligently as possible should you desire to get really strong both in the short term and the long term. To summarize, not only is it going to save you an incredible amount of time as you won't be troubleshooting exercises and variations of different exercises trying to determine where you might have left off on a pull down variation that you've done 8 months ago and you want to bring it back into your accessory lift rotation. It's also going to save you time in the long term as you learn what exercises and in what rep ranges those exercises contribute progressively to your training, and further, which ones might be a waste of time or at the very least aren't really working that well for you where you currently are in your training development. And of course, the reality that the more diligent you are with the measurement of both load and total training volume with respective loads on accessory exercises, the more manageable the stress and recovery aspect of the formula that leads to a desirable adaptation will end up being. Hopefully, you found this to be insightful, potentially a little bit overwhelming if you're not somebody who normally tracks all of this information, but you've now realized that it might be very valuable for you to go about doing so in the future. But as per usual, if you happen to have any questions or curiosities relating to training, nutrition, lifestyle in general, feel free to send them my way. And if I'm able to, I'll make sure to cover them in an upcoming post. And if you haven't already, please follow or subscribe, depending of course on what social media platform you might be seeing this on.